Hi, everybody, and welcome on behalf of Nisai Education Trust to the second in our webinar series. Today, it's a bit of a call for action. And look back in 5 years at a generation of vulnerable teenagers who fell out of society and drifted into crime and unemployment. They need extra help now as they emerge from lockdown. And Her Majesty's Chief Inspector here in the UK stated that whether we like it or not, this pandemic is going to widen the attainment gap, especially in the short term. And she was referencing the poorest, the lowest achieving, and the least motivated of our children. So what we have here is an opportunity to explore in more depth the things we identified in our previous webinar in May with some amazing speakers. It's also an opportunity to consider whether our vulnerable children actually, where they really are in terms of their learning and their emotional position when they return to us in schools, and how we might do things differently through to September and beyond. So I'm going to hand over now to Tristan Williams, who will be moderating this webcast, and thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I've been in this role here in Bristol in a city school now for 4 years. I'm the executive lead over 6 primary schools and 2 special schools. And I have to say, and I'm sure you'll join me in agreeing, that I've never been so proud to be a teacher. The work, the dedication that educationalists have done, not just in this country, but globally, is breathtaking. And I think we should take a step back. We should all consider and actually recognise the amazing work that we've done, not just to support our children in schools, not just to support our families, but also to support our communities. And I'm sure educationalists across the country will be looking back at this pandemic and say, actually, we were one of those key roles that actually kept the country going. And I do think we need to celebrate. I do think we need to feel extremely proud of what we've done. Now, clearly, we are moving into the next phase. There are clearly challenges. And as Paul just touched on, what's going to be happening in the next 6 months is also quite unpredictable. Is there going to be a second wave? Will we be continuing with a blended approach? We're meant to be bringing all the children back here in England in September. But there's one thing that values are also important, and culture is also important. And one thing that I will always stick to is the well-being of my students and my staff members is a priority. Then hopefully the young people that we serve and the staff members that I support, they'll feel valued. They'll be able to function at a level that they can deliver within the academic areas. Now, the guidelines clearly are quite open. And having spoken to other executive leads and chief executives, is all we can actually do is we can do our best. We cannot do better than doing our best. And I think it's important that we remain agile with flexibility of thought, but also that we're kind to ourselves and clearly and to others. If something is working well, then stick with it. We have to consider staggered starts for September, the geography and the locations of gates, doors, entrances, exits. We're also being asked to consider breakfast clubs. Now, I think it's crucial that we reinstate breakfast clubs because the majority of the children that we serve here in Bristol come from areas of real deprivation. So reaching out that level of humanity, reaching out into our communities and starting the day, clearly still social distancing, but what a great way to start the day. We're also looking at some slightly longer days. We're looking at a variety of ways around registrations. We're looking at increasing the length of possible lessons. But this is all in consultation at the moment with parents. with our young people, with the unions, and clearly the staff members that we also serve. We're also looking at interventions. Now, we've got real experts here today that will be able to talk in great detail and great depth about that. But we're not overcomplicating our interventions, because sometimes by overcomplicating things, we make life quite difficult for ourselves. So we are looking at baseline assessments around mental wealth and well-being, as well as some basic, not sophisticated baseline tests, especially in reading to start with, because there's one thing that we've picked up on is that the fluency of some of our young people around reading, that has regressed quite a bit. And I also think that leadership development is important. I also think that for leaders to have an external coach is also important, and that leaders and every staff members working in the industry from September onwards really need to be careful, and as I said previously, to be kind to themselves. So today we have some exceptional speakers. We don't just have speakers from England or the UK, we've actually got people, a person, Professor Todd Cunningham from Canada. So on that point, welcome. I hope you enjoy the next hour or so. And at the end of the session, there will be an opportunity to have questions. And those questions that we won't be able to answer today, we will email you answers. We can keep you fully informed. There's a variety of documentation that I've also produced for September, which is about culture, ethos, and a minimum expectation from my staff members. And again, I'm more than happy to share that with everybody who's participating today. So that's enough from me for now. I'm going to ask Professor Todd Cunningham to introduce himself, and I know that you will enjoy the next 15 minutes or so. Professor Todd Cunningham, welcome. On that note, hand over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me today. Yes, my name's Todd Cunningham. I am a professor at the University of Toronto, and I'm also a registered school and clinical child psychologist here in Ontario, Canada. And in leading up to all this, one of the things I really worried about when I started to hear that our schools were kind of going into lockdown, that we were unable to have traditional learning taking place, was that for a lot of our vulnerable students, those who have challenges in the areas of literacy, numeracy, that these students were going to have a real impact on their learning. These individuals often require additional supports, and how are we going to be able to provide these additional supports in a new format? And to really kind of try and emphasize why this was really important, I started looking to the literature to try and understand from the past why this time was going to be very critical to be able to support our vulnerable students. And this is where I kind of came up with the idea of the COVID slide. This is not an actual real thing, hasn't been studied, but it's based on some prior research known as the summer slide. And what the summer slide, which has been well documented back into the 80s and onward, has shown that during the typical year, you have typical gains of students from kind of the fall to the spring. You have got your typical gains. However, over the summer, when students are not in school, you have a decrease in skill sets, so that when they return in the following year, in the fall, and get measured again, that their scores are somewhere between 10 and 30% lower based on what test you're looking at. And then during the course of the year, again, they make the gains, and then there's a slide down, and there's a gains, and there's a slides down. So when students are not in school, they're not developing these skills. Now, some people have come to say that what the summer slide is showing is there's a lack of learning taking place. That's not what the summer slide is showing. The summer slide is saying that, summer's a bad thing, that, that students are not learning. Students are learning lots of things. They're outside, they're playing around, lots going on. However, what the summer slide is showing is that there's certain critical skills that aren't developing at the same rate. Now, learning is complex. Learning is very, very complex. There's a lot that goes in for a student to be a proficient learner. You know, not only do they have to be able to read, write, and do math, but they have to have critical thinking skills. They have to be able to take notes, organize their days, and also other things such as be able to have good social relationships and be able to regulate their emotions. Their oral language is critical. Their ability to know vocabulary and express their ideas. Their general cognitive abilities, as well as their motor and sensory inputs are also, or outputs and inputs are also critical. So learning's really important. And a lot of this stuff is, and we're always developing these skills. When you're outside running around, you're developing your sensory inputs and your motor outputs as you're playing on jungle gyms and exploring. When you're down at the creek, kids looking into the water, they're developing their critical thinking skills as they're kind of making hypotheses. What's going to happen when I throw this rock into the water, or a bigger rock into the water, and see the rippling effects? The social emotional relationships as peers sit and talk and interact with each other. So a lot of learning is taking place no matter what the environment is. However, when we come to the summer learning, what has been shown is these kind of critical academic skills of reading, writing, and math are the ones that are most at risk. In particularly, what we see is within reading, the basic skills of being able to decode and read words fluently. So as Tristan was just talking about, we're seeing declines in oral reading fluency, how fast and efficient students are able to learn because those skills aren't developing. We see a decrease in spelling ability. Students don't keep up with the accuracy of their spelling. As well in mathematics, we see a decrease in their numeric operations. So when students are outside of school, it's not that all learning stops, but there is an impact on very specific skills, especially in the areas of literacy and numeracy. And this really was kind of emphasized by a great study that looked at one large state in the United States where they measured all the students over a period of years. They tested them both in the fall and spring for about 9 years straight. And they clearly showed that there were these developments during the school years and these regressions over the school or when they were outside of school in both literacy and numeracy. And numeracy was most particularly impacted. So when we think about these skills, kind of, we start losing these skills, it makes sense from kind of a neural perspective. Because when we think about learning, it's kind of like anything. It's like going to the gym. If you go to the gym and you just work out for, 8 months and then you take 2 months off, when you go back to the gym to work on those muscles that you've been working on over the course of the year, then you're not at the same level. You took 2 months off, so you have to kind of build back up. The same when it comes to developing critical skills within academics, such as the ability to code, spell, and do basic numeric operations. As these skills are developing, then if you don't practice those skills, then you don't continue to develop those skills at the same rate. Our brains are very plastic, and as the brain is forming, as we're developing our reading networks and our numeric networks within our brain, we have to be continuously working on those. The biggest things what we see in terms of intervention when helping those things are 3 key variables. You have to have specificity, meaning you have to actually work those areas. So like going to the gym, if you want to build up stronger arm muscles, you have to work on doing weights that work on your arms. Can't be working on your legs, expecting your arms to develop. So we have to have specificity. We're targeting those specific academic skills. We have to have intensity. When we sit down for any given period, we can't just do it for 5 minutes. We have to do it for a period of time. We have to actually get the system working. We have to stress the system enough so it's willing to kind of adapt. Again, going to the gym and just doing 1 rep is not going to allow you to get gains. But the other big one is duration. We have to do it for a long enough period of time. And this is where when we're out of school, has an impact on it. If we don't get a skill up to mastery, where it is fundamentally a skill that is now we are able to implement on a day-to-day basis, such as ability to read accurately and fluently, and students are just picking a book and reading for the fun of it, then if we don't get the skill there, then students don't practice that outside of the learning environment, and so therefore they don't they don't continue it. So the duration piece is a very key piece. And this is where we see the time out of school really having an impact on these learners. Now, if the summer slide was kind of slide affected all students equally, then really the cost of having summer just would mean that we'd have to kind of do some extra work in September to be able to catch students up. If the time off right now from school in the traditional format impacted everybody equally, then when school moved back to a traditional format, then we just kind of pick up where all students are and be able to increase them all together. However, that's not the case. Not all students are impacted the same rate by the time out of the traditional learning environment. So looking at this large data set, what the researchers did is they took kind of the upper third group and the lower third group, and they kind of ran those students through some modeling to see what does it look like. And what they found is students who had the abilities and had access to kind of literacy, to books, that they found that those students over time, they continued to increase. Even though they were out of schools, that these students were actually continuing to increase in their literacy development. Meaning that when they were at home in the summer, they're sitting around reading. My 8-year-old, she's able to read. We worked since kindergarten on building up her literacy skills. She's now powering through one Nancy Drew book a day. It's costing us a fortune in trying to keep Nancy Drews in the house. She sits down, she's got her little reading nook, and to the detriment of her 5-year-old sister who just wants to play, you know, she's sitting there and reading. She's continuing to practice her skills and develop it. She would be this kind of upper line. However, for those students who either A, don't have access to the print, they unfortunately, due to low economics, their family does not have a lot of print in the house, or due to the fact that they might have a challenge being able to read, they can't actually decode and read the words fluently, so they're not enjoying the act of reading. It's actually a real chore for them. Then these students, what the researchers kind of showed, they're the ones who are having actually the most significant declines over the course of the summer. They're the ones who really need that educational environment to be able to protect them and keep those academic skills developing. They're the ones who are not getting the sufficient duration to be able to continue that along. Some research that was done more in my backyard in Ontario, what they did is they took, looking at grade 1 to 3 students, they kind of broke these students up into the kind of the top quarter, the middle half, and then the bottom quarter of students in terms of the literacy abilities. And they measured them over time. From fall to spring, then fall to spring, and fall to spring. And what they found in the Ontario context when it came to literacy, the ability to decode and read words fluently, those are the things they're looking at in terms of the area of literacy, is that the top 1/4 students, they made about 3 gains in their literacy skills over the course of the 2 months that they were off, whereas the bottom 1/4, again, either due to economics or due to learning challenges, they lost about 3 months. And so in the end, there was quite a profound achievement gap that was sitting there. Those students who are able to read and those students who either didn't have access or aren't able to read, we had almost a half a year gap between those two cohorts of students. So the question was, so what can we do about this? How can we be able to help this out? Because if we look at this learning gap, this achievement gap, and you kind of take this achievement gap and you kind of start to stretch it over time, it really becomes quite worrisome. So within the literature of the achievement gap, basically the idea is between, the beginning of grade 2 and the end of grade 2, that what a student learns kind of average one level of a curriculum through that course of the year. They develop at 1 year worth of learning. However, for those students who are having challenges, then over that course of the year, they're not making the same gains of that learning. There's stuff holding them back. And then if you kind of spread that out over time, there's a real discrepancy then between those who are able and have access versus those who aren't able or don't have access, and that gap continues to increase and increase. And this is where we kind of start to see some challenges. The worry is, for me, when our vulnerable students go back in September, or when the traditional learning kind of takes place, is that this gap between those who have access and are able to do it versus those who don't have access or unable to continue developing those skills is going to be so magnified that they are not going to be able to access the regular learning that is taking place within the classroom. So we need to do something to be able to help that out. And what we know is by creating access to the development of these skills really help. In Ontario, looking at just a simple 2 to 3 week literacy intervention that really targeted the foundations of reading and writing and oral reading fluency, we found that all students made gains, but though that vulnerable, that group down here, they made 10 to 30% increase in their gains. So they made even greater gains in their abilities to be able to start to close that gap. And again, this makes a lot of sense. This makes a lot of sense based on what we already know about this vulnerable population. There's something called the Matthew effect, which states the richer get richer, the poor get poorer. Those who are rich in reading and who are able to read, what do they do when they go home for the fun of it? They continue to read. Like my daughter, she loves to read, so she continues to read. So her reading abilities, they just keep going up and up and up over time. But those who have difficulties, what do they do when they go home? They go and have fun. They're playing outside. Well, maybe not outside these days, but they're playing Lego. They're playing they're on their screens. They're doing other things other than the skills that they need to be working at. And though over time their skills do continue to increase, that again, they're not getting that same duration and intensity to increase those skills to be able to keep up with those who are able to do it. So in the end, we know that the summer slide is a thing. It is impacting our most vulnerable students, those who either come from low income families or those who have academic difficulties. And we know that when we come to support them in terms of helping them out, the biggest thing has been trying to keep them in school to be able to provide those opportunities to continue to increase it. So all year schooling where they break up that kind of the summer period into 3 equal parts throughout the year and distribute it has been shown to really help these students continue to learn. But we've also seen that kind of what we call the shadow education system, those that are supports outside of the traditional schooling can also be a critical place to be able to help support students. So again, looking for the opportunity for students to be able to get targeted instruction. And when we talk about targeted instruction, it's not just general curriculum that we're teaching, though that can be important, but really we are focusing in on the critical skills that we know that we have to continue to develop. The basic reading skills, the basic spelling and writing skills, and also the basic mathematical skills. Those are the critical areas that we need to be targeting to ensure that we are kind of helping these students to have the essential skills they need to be able to engage within the learning environment when we go back. And to be able to do this, not only do we have to create that direct instruction to be able to target those skills, but we also have to measure it to ensure that we're not having those slides taking place. And again, one of the things I like about Tristan's introductions is about these wonderful measures that we have, these curriculum baseline measures, these quick 1-minute tests that are very accurate and reliable to be able to gauge how a student is doing. So we can measure on a weekly basis, how is this vulnerable student's reading progressing over time. And if it's not keeping up with what we would predict, then we can change up either our type of programming that we're developing or the intensity of the programming to be able to help those students to get above our projected line so that they're making the type of gains that they're going on. We don't have to just sit back and let the kind of the summer slide or the COVID slide impact these students. We can get in, start measuring them, vulnerable students are, and really increase that time on task for them so that we're helping develop those skills. And in the end, we also have to think about the other barriers that can get in the way. This is a picture of the escalator in the subway station right by my house. And as you can see, you have the escalator and then you have 4 stairs here, the unpredicted barriers that we run into. And as a father, bringing my kids home at night, these forced stairs were the worst things in the world. When you have two kids sleeping in the stroller and you have to pick the stroller up to get up the escalator, I hated those. Similar with this online learning, we're going to run into some challenges where we don't have same equity or access to online environments, the stability of internet, number of devices. So we're going to have to do planning around some of these critical things to be able to get out to those most vulnerable students. How do we reutilize maybe our libraries to be able to be centers where students who can access them? Maybe our school systems need to be open more to our high-risk students at first than our kind of high-performing students, knowing that our high-performing students are going to be able to do better in the online environment. We really need to be thinking critically about the types of interventions and supports that we're doing so that we don't inherently create some built-in barriers that prevent these students from being able to access the essential services to build up those essential skills. So with that, I say thank you very much.
Professor Todd Cunningham, wonderful. Thank you ever so much for such an insightful presentation. Is there one key area, Todd, in terms of reading that you would suggest that colleagues in the teaching profession really focus on as the children return into schools?
It depends on the age. So in the early ages, especially their kindergarten going to grade 1, it's really on the ability to know our sounds and be able to link those sounds to the letters and be able to blend those in, our basic phonics skills. And as we get into grade kind of 2 and upward, it's the speed at which we're able to read, the speed and accuracy that we're able to read. And as we get older, it's in our ability to develop the strategies to understand our reading comprehension strategies. However, beside all that, the other key one that we see that often goes underlying is just simple vocabulary, making sure that students actually have a vast knowledge of the words out there. A vocabulary is just an auditory label for a concept that we have. And again, what we see is in our vulnerable population, their vocabulary, their oral vocabulary is not as well developed as those in our kind of our stronger students. And when it comes to kind of predictive variables of how well a student's going to do in education, it's their ability to self-regulate and our oral language or vocabulary skills that are two big predictors of how well I'm going to be doing in school. So I say keep an eye on those vocabulary skills.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful feedback, and I think you've captured some of those key points extremely well. Thank you, Professor Todd Cunningham. A close colleague of mine. When myself and Barry met, first of all, I was certainly a few pounds lighter than what I am at the moment. The colour of my hair was also different. So Barry, in the 10, 15 years I've known you, you still astound me. You know, Professor Carpenter should have retired on the 30th of June this year. And I think it's fair to say, I'll let you introduce yourself, Barry, but I think you've been busier in the last few months sharing your wisdom, just the same as Professor Todd Cunningham has done now, you know, and inspiring people right across the country. So Barry, welcome. Professor Barry Carpenter, welcome. I shall let you introduce yourself. And just like our first presentation by Professor Todd Cunningham, I know that everybody listening today will be inspired by the next presentation. So Barry, thank you for joining us today, and over to you. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Tristan. And it's good to be with you all this afternoon. Just going to make sure that I can bring up my slides. Yep. Okay. So Tristan mentioned my current role is as professor. I'm actually the UK's first professor of mental health in education. Mental health is becoming very much a domain of work within schools. Probably by mental health, we really mean mental ill health. And so it's probably more accurate to talk about well-being and emotional well-being within our schools. My background is as a teacher for many years, 3 times head teacher, or in international terms, a school principal. I then served for 5 years as the National Director for Children with Complex Needs at our Government Department for Education in London, where I carried out the international research project on the new generation of children coming into our school system, those prematurely born children, those with something Todd will know well, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. I've written 2 books around that. So that's been very much my career. And then latterly, I've gone more into academia, working really part-time in academia and part-time as an international consultant. And my last book was on girls in autism, which took me on a 12-country world tour to launch it, which is very exciting and just slightly curtailed by the coronavirus. I want to consider this afternoon this concept of a recovery curriculum. Way back in, well, it's not that far really, on April the 25th, so not even 3 months yet, my son Matthew is a high school principal, and I actually published the recovery curriculum just as a think piece and information with colleagues, because as Todd has clearly demonstrated in his powerful presentation, we're an evidence-based profession, teaching and psychology, and yet we are having to make judgments at the moment not based on clear evidence, and all we can hope for, colleagues, is best judgments, and we should not be frightened of those best judgments, because they have to be in the moment, not what went on previously, not always what earlier studies told us, although they can inform our thinking. Our judgment has to be in the here and now, because we are encountering phenomena that we've never seen before. And Todd was saying to me earlier about parents worrying that their children were becoming switched off, were becoming disengaged from online learning. And certainly that's an observation parents I've been speaking to have made, where they've said the joy of learning has gone. Their children are still going through the routines and rituals, but it's joyless learning. And so I want us to consider how we're going to reignite learning as our children begin to enter the school system. Here is the think piece I referred to, and can I refer you then to that website? By next Friday, there will be then 15 podcasts on there. There are 12 there currently, 2 in edit and 1 to be made next week following an online conference, which is open to everyone. It's free. It's next Wednesday morning, and it's called Reflections on Recovery, reviewing for us as an educational profession what's been happening to us in these last 3 months. And as I say, the information for that's on my website, and it's also on this website, recoverycurriculum.org, where you'll find a vast array of resources. What's been a joy in this pandemic period is the openness with which people have freely given of their own professional skills and shared them with many others. So what's a recovery curriculum? I've had people write to me asking if they could purchase a copy. No, it's a construct. We toyed, Matthew and I, my son, with the word concept, but actually we chose construct because it's part of that wider word construction. And this is about the construction of a recovery curriculum that meets the personalized needs of your school population. In fact, it was interesting listening to Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools, Amanda Spielman, yesterday, where she talked about rebuilding. And she was absolutely right. Construction, rebuilding, the 2 words are very compatible. We need to be rebuilding the learning of our children. Yes, we can use subjects, but it needs to be subject-based therapeutic intervention. To expect children to have gone into lockdown in March on page 67 and return to page 67, say in September when all of the British schools open, is frankly naive. We need to rekindle the flame of learning in our children. We may be teaching literacy, but we may do an hour-long session in 3 20-minute bursts with some other physical activity incorporated. Children will not have the concentration skills when they come back. There is validity in data that we've had prior to pandemic, but it may not hold under the hyper-vigilant and anxious pressures children have been in during this pandemic period. Ultimately, those of you to school leaders, we need compassionate leadership in place. And we need to go back to what were the aims and values of our schools and our educational communities prior to this pandemic, and let them inform what you're now going to offer your children and young people. Interestingly, again, our inspectorate has said there will be no inspections in the autumn term. Often Ofsted will come out to do accountability checks and be supportive. They will want to see clear plans about how you are re-engaging the disengaged in learning in your school. What is the curriculum diet for next term? It may not be the conventional curriculum diet. In fact, I would be as bold as to say if we try to feed that to some children, we will end up with some educationally very malnourished children. So best informed judgments should guide your way. And it has to be, as I've said, a personalised response. There are 5 losses, as I perceive them, from trends in the general reporting as they relate to children. So again, not a systematic research study, not a strong evidence base, but a series of observations based on emergent trends. Best judgment. The loss of routine, the loss of structure, the loss of friendship, the loss of opportunity, those students that should have been sitting examinations, who are now being assessed by other means, feel that there's a loss of a rite of passage there, and loss of freedom. Children have been locked down. This is not a natural state for children. They may have had guardians, some do not. We talk about online learning. Let me just share with you that my son, as high school principal, was asked by a member of the public to go down to McDonald's last week, where some of his students who have not yet been readmitted to school were seen loitering around McDonald's. So he went down there, and what he discovered was a group of Year 9 students who were there with their laptops. They'd been given laptops either by the school or through the government scheme, but were in homes that didn't have Wi-Fi. That just busts any of our myths around how successful online learning has been. It has been incredibly valuable to so many children. But what are we doing for all of our children and young people? And those losses can generate in any of our children these responses, a bereavement response. I think there's a notion of some prolonged mourning, as the literature would call it, in some of our children, for the loss of those friendship groups, the loss of their school. I know parents of some autistic children who have to drive past the school every week just to convince their child that the building has not been demolished. And then there's the whole raft of attachment issues that some of our children will be going through. You know, children, particularly young children in the primary phase, can be very bonded to their teacher, and rightly so. And for, again, no one's fault, there is no blame here. But on that wretched day in March, where we had to stand in front of our children and said that Mr. Boris said our schools are going into lockdown, our country's going into lockdown, there was a severance of the bonds. Some of our children will have felt abandoned. Some of our children with special needs will not have comprehended why this needs to happen. And the anxiety began to rise on that day. And all of these, as the Archbishop of Canterbury said in a powerful speech recently, are elements of trauma. They are all traumas, in effect. Our Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK is talking now about lockdown anxiety. Again, a reported phenomena, not heavily researched yet, but we have to go with the flow, providing it is sincerely articulated and is based on definite trend evidence. Then we have to go with how we make responses. So let's apply what it is that we currently know, as Todd did in his presentation. So what we know currently about anxiety, and particularly those of you that know the studies of Professor Demuta Frith, know that anxiety can be a key block to learning. When the cortisol in the brain rises, if it rises and hits the surface, it will actually, of the brain, it will actually prevent the imprint of memory in the brain. So you could have a child sitting in your class who is very quiet, is seeming to do whatever activity you've set, is very restrained. If I observed your lesson and then asked that child afterwards, what was that lesson that your teacher just taught? What's the key thing you remember? They'd probably say, I don't know. They're not being rude. It's just that their memory did not imprint. They have not retained anything from that lesson. And the anxious child is not a learning child. So what are the learning gains going to be? So we have to have methods in place that deal with anxiety, whether it's about our group size. Some children are going to be phobic about social distancing, are wanting to wash their hands. I mean, I just wonder how much OCD is going to be on the rise as a result of this period. We need to have strategies in place. We don't know what's going to hit us when our schools fully resume. These are the 5 levers that my son Matthew wrote as part of that paper. And these levers are around, think of the word lever as levering, a pedagogical lever, levering that child back into a state of learning, about relationships. That has to be our starting point. Start with relationships and work towards building resilience again in your children and young people. Reach out to greet. We cannot tell each other, our colleagues included, that it's just wonderful to see you again. Why would we say that many times? Because in Britain, 44,000 people have lost their lives. We are survivors, and we should mourn their loss and rejoice our state as a survivor. And in the community, we need to rebuild our school communities. And our parents need to be, more than ever, a dynamic in that school community. We had lost what I would call true parent partnership in many of our schools. The assessment systems were never in parent speak. Now parents have taken charge. They've much to tell you as a teacher about how their child learns. Value it, treasure it, sustain it, build a stronger school, build a more powerful educational community. And let's explicitly talk to children using metacognition about their learning processes, grow their confidence. They've been learning at home, but that is different to the social dynamics of learning in school. And make it a transparent curriculum. Again, my son asked his student parliament, what is it you want from us when you come back to school? And they all said, we want somebody to scientifically explain to us what this coronavirus is, what's COVID-19, why has it been so destructive, why it has been a worldwide pandemic with a global impact, why? And we need to talk to them. I don't think that's an unrealistic expectation. Is your lesson prepared? And space, just space to be. New Zealand, I was on the phone to New Zealand earlier today, are now finding panic attacks in their children as they return to school. The joy and exhilaration of returning has passed. So have you got space ready for children to self-regulate and go to that safe space? Space can mean all sorts of things, but we need to help our children rediscover their self-image, self-concept, self-esteem. So we need holistic recovery, something for everyone. That lesson about coronavirus is for everyone. Some will need a more personalized, needs-led approach. And again, this is a curriculum that will have literacy and numeracy in it, but it's the style of delivery, it's the pedagogy that's key. But some of our children, I've one federation of schools that's planning a kind of nurture group for 2 years for that longer period of exploration. Here's a free download you can get. It's a wordless book on beating the virus, deliberately wordless, because we want emotional release around the coronavirus here. If you put words in place here, then the frontal cortex will kick in the decoding and encoding processes. There's a time and a place for literacy. There's a time and a place for emotional resilience and emotional expression. We want children to work through this story. Sound pedagogical principles of co-construction, co-creation, co-production. Free, downloadable. Look at the website. And I'm pleased to announce today that I've had a commission for 2 children's books. The first is with the artist at the moment, and she's kindly sent me the book cover to share with you today. I've written 2 books, wordless books, and there's a whole literature on wordless books. Lucy and Lenny in Lockdown, and the second book is Lucy and Lenny Return to School. They will be available. I've fundraised the production costs of these and given that to the publisher so that every child in our country will be able to get these free of charge. They're designed particularly for primary children and children with special educational needs and disabilities. If you're getting really stuck what to do with your children, create happiness boxes. Let children put in things that make them happy. Have those happiness boxes in your classroom for the children to go to and to self-regulate, or they've been working really well, give them 5 minutes to de-escalate the emotional tension. Often our children, often we are hypervigilant. Hypervigilance is not a good resting state for the brain. So those of you that are very perceptive will realize we have a series of glorified shoeboxes here. Well, that's the first art lesson planned, isn't it? How you decorate the shoebox. Make a happiness box. Can I ask you, colleagues, think about what you would put in your happiness box. So we have now an opportunity to turn some of this around. Now is the time to address that loss in trauma and make sure it doesn't rob our children of lifelong opportunities. Yes, mental health, but let's think about actually mental wealth. Colleagues, you have treasure in your hands, treasure that can transform lives. If you invest that treasure, that wealth in our children, then you will make it that one day their aspirations for their future can be a vision that becomes one day a reality. They will not forever be scarred by this pandemic. They will not be robbed of their dreams for the future because the power of your teaching has transformed those lives. We need to do all of that, as I've said already, with compassion, but also, as the Maori would say, with kindness. Because if kindness is shown, then kindness is what you shall receive. Some websites for you to follow up. I wish you colleagues well with your endeavours and making our children once more joyous learners. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barry Carpenter. Uplifting as always. Barry, do you have one concern? And I'm going to just ask this question around young people, education, healthcare planning, specialist settings. Is there anything that's at the forefront of your mind that if there was one or two key points that you would suggest to school leaders and teachers within specialist settings, what would you recommend?
Well, in those specialist settings, Tris, we already have the research evidence very solid that those are children who are more vulnerable and their mental health is more fragile. For every 5 children with special needs on any school register, mainstream or special, then we know that at least 3 will develop a mental health issue. We know in our population of young people with autism that up to 71%, I think the latest studies are saying, will develop a mental health issue with the onset of adolescence. So we need to go gently in our teaching approaches. We need to, that principle that we have in autism of using now and next. What's happening now? What's happening next? Actually, I think that could work, Tris, for any child. Yeah. We're going to get some very anxious children come back who don't need to be worrying that it's PE at the end of the day and how they're going to manage or whatever. Or actually, there's a big dilemma around PE in high schools because you can't get all the children in the changing room. So are they going to wear their sweaty kit all day if they've had PE first lesson? Yeah. So there are all sorts of dynamics. And I think there are some techniques we have already in our toolbox that are absolutely right to maximize, and I say the now next principle. And those visual approaches, if you don't show it visually so a child can check, because if they're anxious, they're going to lose what you've said is going to be happening over the lunchtime period. It needs to be written down with pictorial or symbolic illuminations alongside it. And again, we've got a rich history of that stuff.
That's wonderful, Barry. Thank you. And thank you again for joining us, Barry, for uplifting and words that clearly inspire every time I hear you talk. So thank you, Professor Barry Carpenter. Interesting journey before I come on to Margaret Rooms, our next guest speaker. And as Professor Barry Carpenter knows this, my son was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I remember, Barry, having big conversations with you when he was sort of age 9, how he would cope in secondary. And what was interesting out of that process of understanding what my son's needs were is that he left primary school going into secondary school with a label of having additional needs, but also was clearly underachieving. But actually, by amending, personalising the curriculum, by personalising the approaches to my son who had a diagnosis of dyslexia, actually he came out at the end of the journey of GCSEs with incredible grades. And when he phoned me from school that day, I just burst into tears because I was so proud. I'd been highly anxious over the sort of 6 years where he was moving from primary into secondary school. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because Margaret Rooms MB has done an incredible amount of work on dyslexia and the impact, you know, that experts like you, Margaret, have had on families like me. I can't thank you enough. So that is a personal story for me that I felt was right and appropriate to share with you now. So our next guest speaker today is Margaret Rooms. Margaret, if you could introduce yourself as well. And I also know that everybody out there will really, really enjoy this session with you too. So Margaret, welcome.
Well, thank you. I can't see my face at the moment. I don't know what's happening. What have I done wrong? Okay, well, maybe it is working. I'll just assume that it is. My name's Margaret Rooms, and thank you for inviting me for this today. I don't think I deserve that praise from you, Tristan, but the dyslexia story is featuring again in some of the teaching that I'm doing now. But really my main concern now is with a wider literacy. When I first started teaching, I was teaching what we would now call moderate learning difficulties. And those children and adults often get a raw deal within our system, as often the focus is on the specific learning difficulties. So what I want to do today is talk about, I'll just share my screen, is to talk about work I've been doing, teaching online and with the online program Units of Sound, which is what I've been working with for 25 years, but perhaps in general terms so that we can also see that these principles apply in other areas as well. So if I just start this PowerPoint here. Okay, so I was given this title of Out of School Intervention, Bridge the Gap in Literacy, which I thought was really very good. And I'm just going to focus on this a little bit because I feel most of my career I've been bridging gaps. And the out of school element, of course, is what we're thinking about now because schools have been closed. But for many years, I've actually, excuse me, been promoting using Units of Sound and setting it for homework so that students aren't losing curriculum time in school. And so that has a very particular relevance perhaps today. And as Todd mentioned, how all these gaps in literacy have been exacerbated during the lockdown everywhere, those gaps were difficult for schools to cope with anyway, and now the gap has got even larger. So I'd like to show some suggestions for how to bridge those gaps and give some practical examples. I don't know why this isn't working. Okay, so school closures have created a greater literacy deficit, of course. And the special needs pupils and vulnerable students, I think, have been given a priority during lockdown. I'm the governor of a secondary school locally here, and I know that those students have been invited into school. Our schools haven't been locked down completely. And I'm hoping that in the autumn, if we do end up in some places with parts in school, part home, that these particular pupils will be able to be in school all the time. I was also interested in the mention, Professor Cunningham mentioned about McDonald's and those students not having internet access. And I know again, the school where I'm a governor was able to identify all the students who didn't have computers before school was locked down and gave them school laptops, and also provided dongles where there weren't there wasn't internet access. So there is a way around it when there's a will. But you see, the barriers to literacy intervention in schools are the same as before. They're just bigger. So too often, it's not about having the right staff or materials. It's about the logistics that means this teaching doesn't take place. And just to give you an example, we've been working with the University of Georgia State in Atlanta, Georgia, and they've been working with about 60 adults with units of sound. And they had a group of over 20 that was starting right at the very beginning, so not being able to read sat, cat, mat. So these adults had been in school all those years. They were now aged between 20 and 60, and they hadn't really got the very basics in reading. So those comments that Todd mentioned about practice and having enough time is very relevant, and I'll mention that again. But let's assume that we have the staff and we have the teaching materials. So what happens then? So the school has to think, well, when are we going to do these lessons? Paul has just told me to hurry up, so I'll do my best. The school day is already timetabled. So where do you find these times for these extra lessons before school, after school, lunch times, tutor times? Take mode of class, but then there's that tussle about which ones. You can feel the stress building already. And you think, well, when the schools go back, we're going to have more students needing this and for longer. So how does all this work? And then let's just say we do manage to timetable it. How many lessons do the students actually get? And I'll mention again Todd's words about having sufficient practice for long enough time. Because too often intervention lessons are cancelled when the teacher's ill. When if the teacher was teaching a curriculum lesson, then you'd get another teacher in. But often with intervention, the lesson is cancelled. Teacher has to cover another class, room is needed for something else. There's a play rehearsal, there's a sports rehearsal. Teacher's on a training course, there's a school trip somewhere. There's a meeting, well, there's always a meeting, there's lots of meetings. And then there's the beginning of term and end of term, and we don't start at the beginning of term and we don't work in that final week. So how much lessons do students actually get? And then, because every time you cancel a literacy lesson, the subliminal message to the student is, this doesn't matter to us. This is not important. And then we wonder why students aren't engaged. So how can units of sound help with this? So the majority of the work is independent, so it can take place out of school hours, set it for homework. Although I'm focusing at the moment during these extraordinary measures with online lessons, it can also be a bit in school, a bit out of school, it's monitored in school, but a lot of the work can take place or in an after-school club. Tutor doesn't have to be a teacher. Teaching assistants, volunteers can work extremely well. Students stay in the curriculum lessons. Teachers can have their meetings, etc. But students gain independent learning skills with benefits all around, and that is just so important. The online records mean teachers can monitor progress at any time. There's no need to ever cancel a lesson, and there's no individual lesson preparation. So I can move this one on, I think, just to go back from that. Now I have been working with 4 students, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them today. 3 of them are in Ontario, in Canada, and 1 is in the United States. We do have an American version of this program. So we started in June, so we've had about 7 weeks of lessons. They didn't all start at the same time. I do 30-minute sessions, and have done more sessions in early weeks, and because I'm trying to use this time when they're out of school to make as many gains as possible, so that when they go back to school, they will not only not have regressed, that they will actually be starting at a higher level. So that is what we're doing. 30-minute lessons, I think, is about right, because online lessons are more focused, more concentrated than you would have if it was face-to-face. And a lot can be achieved in that time. So the program there is units of sound. Okay, so I just come out of that. And I now want to go to units of sound. Just trying to get rid of all these WebEx things which are getting in my way. Okay, well, I'll start here. Right, now that's what I want. So this is the units of sound screen that students work with. And you can see we've got 4 main components. Reading, which starts with decoding. We're working on auditory and visual patterns. And there are 6 different activities within reading. Spelling, which has 3, working on single words. And then we take those and work on memory phrases, and then dictation sentences. So that really all these 3 develop spelling, and then we use those dictation sentences to develop writing. Now, one of the benefits of online learning, and which you can do from home, you're not sharing my screen, it says. Okay, I don't know why that is. I'm sorry, I do apologize for that. Okay, so I'd better say some of that again. But one of the advantages of the online learning is that you can do little and often. And if you think about the difficulties I mentioned about arranging intervention in schools, then you can't really do it for 10 minutes, but at home you can. And reading, a page of reading takes about 10 minutes. Each of these are a bit shorter. So you can, especially for primary school students, you can have very short little sessions. You would use units of sound with students of ages up and older. Okay. So if I now look at my students, I'm just going to have a look at Max. Sorry, I'm going to look at Trevor first. I'm just going to have a look at the overview. So Trevor is 12 years old next week. He's in a mainstream school. He doesn't have any special provision in school at all. And these are the 3 stages of units of sound. And really, when you're in stage 3 for reading, you're becoming an independent reader. You start here with cat, fat, mat, and it ends with 4 5-syllable words with quite an adult vocabulary. So he started here sort of bang in the middle. He doesn't like reading at all. He doesn't pick up a book. In fact, he would go out of his way to avoid it. Now, one of the things with units of sound we have is that you have a separate placement for reading and spelling. And you can see the huge gap from where he started between spelling and reading. And so we have to work on these skills separately at different levels because there is a massive gap here. Our aim is to complete stage 2, get into 3 by Christmas, and to have completed stage 1 of spelling by then. So that's our aim. And he is really working extremely well at the moment. He works independently, and we've also started to develop the writing. Now, Max has not that very different a profile, although you can see we've had to fill in more gaps here, but he is 2 years younger. He's an extremely able young man. I mean, both of them are very capable boys, but they are nowhere near reaching their potential. And the independent work of units of sound is already making a difference in their confidence in tackling work, their willingness to work, picking up reading. And I can tell when I'm working with them how quickly, how much more automaticity they've developed in their skills. Okay, so I think I need to stop this presentation at the moment because I know we're running out of time and we want to get on with questions. So I do apologize for that. Okay, so I'm going to stop the sharing and hopefully that takes you back to Tristan.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for your time, Margaret. Wonderful, thank you for all that information. I am just going to see if there's any questions coming through at the moment. David, do we have any questions?
Yep, I've sent those through. Let me just pull that back up.
That's great, thank you. And if our panel happy to answer, that would be great.
Right, what I'll do is I'll send you that one.
Okay. So the first question, how do we minimise the gaps of the learning achievement between urban and rural students who have online learning access and have no access due to inability to join the online class? Todd, would that be something for you to answer?
Yeah, so this is something that I think all education systems are struggling with right now, is that there is not equality among access. And in Ontario, our rural communities are also at risk. They don't have the ability, they don't have the internet capacity to be able to sustain online video learning. And so this is where I think we do have to get more creative around how are we looking at the rollout of education come the new year. When we have to kind of make some decisions about who's going to be in the classroom because they are needing that kind of direct instruction from the teacher, maybe we need to prioritize some of our high-risk students first. So maybe all students cannot come to the classroom. Maybe our high-performing students are going to, unfortunately, be a little disenfranchised from the classroom experience by providing them with more materials that they can do at home through a more parent-driven or self-driven learning process, but then take our more vulnerable students and bring them into the classroom in those smaller numbers so that we can give those direct interventions to them. But also going back to the mental health issues, we also have to consider that sometimes our our high performing students need more of that social interaction, social engagement. So how do we facilitate that? So I think we're going to have to be very flexible around how we're going to do it. But I think the key thing is we need to look at the resources we have available. We need to look at the classroom as a key resource, and we need to provide that key resource to those who are most at risk so that we're allowing them to make those kind of key gains that we need to sustain them in their educational journey.
That's great. And Todd, there's another question here for you. The summer curve, how do you see that comparing with a COVID curve? Are we seeing similar rates in drops, or do you think it's going to be higher, lower? And how do you think we'll be able to track that?
Yeah, so excellent question. And we have actually, I haven't seen any actual data on it. I've just called it the COVID curve as a way of trying to conceptualize what was going on based on some past research that we already had. If we kind of extrapolate that in a 2-month period that we kind of see our vulnerable students losing 10 to 30% of their skills, then one could say, well, that could actually, be 2, 3, 4 times magnified based over the course of the time that we are out of school, if nothing is done along the way. Because we have some online learning, because there's something that might trickle, but it's not going to be until we start to get back into school and we kind of do some of our, again, standardized testing to be able to see our pre-post COVID period and see what actually come out, that we'll have a much better understanding. Now, not saying that as educators, we can't get in there right now to start measuring this, using our curriculum baseline measures, our CBMs, and actually measuring and working with our students and taking those kind of snapshots on a week by week or monthly period, we can actually see for ourselves how are our students doing. And so that can give us immediate updated information about who are those more vulnerable students, who are those that really are suffering the most, so that we can provide more directed intervention resources to them. So we don't have to just sit back and wait and see what comes out. We can be very active in identifying those students.
No, that's wonderful. Got a very complimentary comment here from YouTube. I like the happy box. A few more suggestions which educators can use, and I'm sure, Barry, we can share a few more ideas. I am conscious that we've overrun, and I am going to say a few words before I ask just Paul Keenlyside, Executive Director with Nisai, just to close. But Margaret Rooms, thank you for your contribution today. It's very much appreciated. Professor Todd Cunningham, thank you for your contribution, and Professor Barry Carpenter as well. It's an honour actually to be able to introduce people, MBE, CBE, professionals, and keep my words very carefully and put on the image that I am, on par with the panel today. So I think you've all been incredible. I think you've all brought something fascinating to the table today. But for me, just the last 3 points is that make sure that we look at and agree and implement compassionate and supportive leadership. I think that's crucial. And be kind to yourself, and remember how remarkable you really are as human beings and as professionals. And the last point from me before I hand over to Paul is, please remind yourselves of your successes and the lives that you have transformed to date, and those lives who you will transform in the future. As educators, you should be proud of what you've achieved to date and what you will achieve in the future. Thank you from me. Paul, closing comments, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tristan. It's always very difficult to follow the passion you're a principal. But I'd just like to say to everybody, there's some real, and there's something about equity and equality and how this pandemic is affecting what our young people are. There's something about digital literacy, which is absolutely critical to their development and the development of education over the next 10 to 15 years. This is a right that we enable our children to have access to the digital world. I just want to put a flag up talking about our most vulnerable young people. The next webcast, which will be in September, will be looking at alternatives to alternative provision. About pivoting and innovation in this most critical of fields over the next few years. So to everybody for joining us, and especially to the wonderful people that have been on this webcast. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.